Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I bring you a viewer suggested video where I discuss Agatha Christie's books by the decade. What is the strongest decade for Agatha Christie? We shall find out as I rank all 6 decades of Christie's works as a whole, that is the 1920s, the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. I will not be spoiling any books or short stories in this video, so you don't have to worry about that. But before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Let's begin at the bottom. The worst decade for Agatha Christie, and by worst, I mean by Christie standards, of course. Even Christie's worst is about mid for everyone else, but this was a pretty easy choice for me. Christie's weakest decade is her last, the 1970s, and there are only 6 novels published in the 1970s: Passenger to Frankfurt, Nemesis, Elephants Can Remember, Postner to Fate, Curtain, and Sleeping Murder. And to be honest, those last two were not written in the 70s, so I'm not even really factoring them in here. Those 4 novels are largely bad, with the exception of Nemesis. These are some of the absolute worst novels by Christie, and it's clear by the 70s Christie's powers were failing. Her writing, her plotting, they just weren't coming together to form these excellent productions she did for 50 years prior. She becomes rambling and nonsensical. There rarely seems to be any point to the story she's telling. And I think she becomes a lot more defensive of criticism against her. Elephants Can Remember and Posture and Fate really seem like they were written to refute these claims about her capacity as a writer. And, sadly, she fails to make those cases. I don't ever reread any of these books. I can't even tell you the last time I read, Passenger to Frankfurt. Nemesis is the best of these books written in the 1970s, but it still has a lot of issues, especially in the plot construction and the plausibility. This is not Christie at her best, nor are these books, really acceptable as mysteries or thrillers. They have issues of ingenuity, construction, entertainment, clarity, plausibility. Posture of Faith is one of the worst books ever. That book would not have been published today or even in the 70s by any other author but Agatha Christie. And it's a shame, was this even edited? I suppose it was, but it really needed to undergo substantial editing, and it just wasn't. And we know from correspondence from this time that Christie's daughter and her husband were upset about the quality of her work at this point. And there's no short stories published in the 1970s either. There are new collections but it's just a new assembly of previously published short stories, and they really did that to mask the fact that Christie couldn't put out a novel or couldn't put out a new short story collection every year like she did for decades prior. So I don't really count those collections here. The 1970s are a rough time for Christie's work, so it's in last place here at number 6. At number 5, a much better decade, but still one that has its issues, and that is going back 1 decade to the 1960s. And a lot of these issues come from the end of the decade, obviously, where Christie was starting to slow down, though it's not nearly as pronounced as in the 1970s. I think her issues in the back half of the 1960s stem more from Christie trying and experimenting with new things, but those things are simply not working out. You do get a lot of Christie exploring the 1960s and not really understanding the culture and the youth and all that. I don't think this is a case of Christie declining mentally or her skills waning, but her taking risks that aren't paying off. In the end of the decade, we have At Bertram's Hotel, Third Girl, By the Pricking of My Thumbs, and Halloween Party, all of which are well below average for Christie, but not truly terrible. They all have something to recommend them, but they are clearly not Christie's best. Endless Night is the only good book she has in the second half of the 60s. And beginning of the decade is much better, with The Pale Horse, The Mirror Cracked, and Caribbean Mystery. But I don't think those books are top tier either. You can argue about Pale Horse, but although I think these books are good, but again, I think Christie just does better most of the other times. Next week's video I have is a review of A Caribbean Mystery, which was published in 1964. So I just reread it, and I did start noticing Christie, not tying up all her loose ends. Some of those issues that characterized her works in the 1970s are starting to seep in here a little bit. Not nearly as bad as in the 70s, but you can see it happening. And I realized The Caribbean Mystery is just not as strong of a mystery as I had remembered it. and I did notice quite a few weak spots. You know, I would mark, Caribbean Mystery as sort of the last book in Christie's bibliography before we get to her late career. It's a good transition novel in that it's still pretty good, but those flaws are starting to become more noticeable. And that's what the 1960s is. It's a bit of a transition from mid-career to late-career Christie. But we still have, Endless Night in the 60s, which I think is a fantastic novel. It's one of her best. The Clocks is early 1960s, which I've always liked because I enjoy like Unknown Corpses, but let's be honest, that one is highly flawed. Once again, we have no new short stories published in the 1960s, just new collections of previously published stories. At least no new mystery short stories, I should say. There is the Star Over Bethlehem collection, which is a bit of like religious poetry and short stories. I enjoy that collection, but it's not like something to really prop up the 1960s. This decade is a bit of a mixed bag because there's a lot to praise it, with like The Pale Horse and Endless Night and even Caribbean Mystery. It's still a pretty decent read. It's enjoyable. But the majority of the novels published here have, some significant flaws or just lackluster. Christie is starting to slip in quality here a little bit, so I had to put the 1960s here at number 5. At number 4, and these two were tough. The top two decades were clear to me, but the third and fourth spots were the hardest to grapple with. I went back and forth a lot between these two, and ultimately it really came down to the short stories, believe it or not. So at number 4, we're sticking with the reverse chronology with the 1950s. And, coming into this list, I did think the 1950s would be at number 3. I love the early 50s with A Murder is Announced, After the Funeral, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, A Pocket Full of Rye, all of which are superior titles in my opinion. These are some of my personal favorites, and the beginning of the 1950s still has that post-World War II era feel to it that I love. I absolutely adore that setting for mystery novels. The second half of the 1950s is no slouch either. We have 450 from Paddington, Dead Man's Folly, Ordeal by Innocence, and Cat Among the Pigeons. Very strong novels as well. There are strong plays from the 1950s. We have The Unexpected Guest, Spider's Web, and of course, The Mousetrap. And there are also, unfortunately, some clunkers in the 50s as well, like Destination Unknown, Hickory Dickory Dock, They Came to Baghdad. I've never been that big a fan of, like, They Do It with Mirrors. No, it's these duds that kept the 1950s out of the number 3 spot, as well as the lack of short stories. There are a few short stories, but they aren't as good, in my opinion. And while the number 3 decade also has its duds, I felt the 1950s had less highs and the duds were worse. I don't find Destination Unknown or They Came to Baghdad interesting at all. And while they might not be as bad as quality wise, they certainly are like less enjoyable to read and less memorable. I should also mention that there are the final 2 Mary Westmacott novels published in the 1950s, A Daughter is a Daughter and The Burden. I have not read any Mary Westmacott novels, so I cannot comment on their quality, but certainly worth mentioning here at least. The 1950s serves, again, as a bit of a transition, not only in Christie, but in mystery fiction in general. The 1950s is the new era after the Golden Age. The Golden Age is typically described as the time between the 2 world wars. I might quibble exactly about what the dates are, but the early 1950s works have a lot in common with the 30s and the 40 novels. And as the decade progresses, we slowly move into new things, new technology, new science, new culture, new attitudes that change the way people act and thus change the way stories are told and the plot of these stories. And while I enjoy these stories, I just simply don't think they're as iconic as her previous works, so I place the 1950s here at number 4. At number 3, the decade that fought for this spot with the 1950s is the 1920s. And like I said, I debated a lot over these two, and there were a few deciding factors that made me select the 1920s above the 1950s. The 1920s has a slew of iconic short stories, not limited to Poirot Investigates, Poirot's Early Cases, Partners in Crime, and others that are very good. The 1950s simply doesn't have that. And the 1920s has more iconic novels: The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, The Secret Adversary. This is the decade where we meet Poirot and Hastings and Japp and Tommy and Tuppence and Colonel Race and Superintendent Battle. And while the 1920s probably has more duds than the 50s, like The Secret of Chimneys, The Big Four, Mystery of the Blue Train, those duds are at least readable. Those thrillers and lackluster mysteries have like a whimsicalness about them that makes them endearing. I have a soft spot for like The Seven Dials mystery and The Man in the Brown Suit that I simply don't have for like Destination Unknown. And partially the reason for some of these duds is because Christie was in a bad contract she wanted out of, so she would just offer whatever thriller she could conjure up together quickly. But these books are iconic. Now Roger Ackroyd is the only like truly elite novel in this bunch, but the short stories make up for that. They are wonderful, as I already mentioned. These short stories really do form the foundation for Christie's works. She often references them in future stories. She expanded a few, and quite frankly, I think they hold up better than some of the novels. Obviously, the most important book to discuss here is The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is one of her most famous novels. The twist here is obviously important, but what is more important is this is the book that put Christie on the map. It is the first to transition her into her own writing style. Her mysteries before this, and even, including this one, have elements and are heavily influenced by, like, Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle. She did not have her own unique style yet, and Ackroyd and the shock of it and the twists of it allow her to do so. She isn't able to demonstrate that in the 1920s because this book was published in 1929, but it is the launching point for what we see moving forward. I simply think the 1920s are a more important decade in Agatha Christie, so I have it here at number 3. At number 2, and this wasn't really much of a debate in my mind, as much as I love a lot of books from this decade, the other decade is clearly stronger, and here I have the 1940s. World War II and its aftermath are heavy influences in this decade, and I love that setting, and Christie does it spectacularly. 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe, NRM are both heavily set in the midst of the war, and while those books have some issues, I think they are both wonderful, especially in the setting and the tone. The 1940s also has, novels less influenced by the war that stand out. Evil Under the Sun, The Body in the Library, which reintroduced Miss Marple after a long absence, Five Little Pigs, The Moving Finger, Toward Zero, Death Comes as the End, Sparkling Cyanide, The Hollow, Taken at the Flood, and Crooked House are all wonderful books, with the last few being heavily influenced by the aftermath of the war and the passing of time. Things are not what they used to be. Servants are hard to come by. There's food rationing and heavy taxes. Lots of people, especially young men, perish. And Christie uses all of these things brilliantly, not only in the setting, but also in the plot. There are very few duds from the 1940s. I think Sad Cypress is one, but I recognize I'm alone on that hill. 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe is meh, but not bad. They don't reach the bad category of novels. We have a lot of good short stories, most notably The Labors of Hercules, which is often considered her best collection of short stories. There's also Three Blind Mice, which would later become The Mousetrap. This is a very productive decade for Christie, with her churning out 2 novels most years. I think something not in favor of the 1940s is that the number 1 decade has truly big titles. The 1940s doesn't really have any iconic novels, at least, to people who aren't obsessed with Christie, like I am, and I suspect you all are. The number 1 decade is jammed packed with iconic novels and is also more productive. And to be fair, some of these early 1940s novels were written in the previous decade. Christie was churning out novel after novel. She called herself a sausage factory because of how quickly she could write these at the peak of her career. She and her publishers would hold these books back to spread them out, and also for tax purposes. Christie admits to having, at one point, half a dozen books waiting to be published. And again, I bring up the war. Christie was terrified of dying in the Blitz, and she occupied her mind and her time by writing, and writing quite well. The 1940s are a bit freeing for her as well. Previously she wrote a lot of Poirot novels. She had something like 8 or 9 Poirots in a row, and she did this because he made her the money, and the public wanted him and demanded him. But in the 1940s, Christie took her writing into her own hands. She wrote what she wanted to write, and by this time she earned it, and the public ate up whatever she put out. We have less Poirot moving forward, and more Miss Marple, and more standalones. I would argue she gets more creative creative in the 1940s in terms of taking risks. The 1940s is such a wonderful decade and would be the best for any other author out there, but this is Agatha Christie, so it's only at number 2. And at number 1, never in doubt for me, the best Christie decade is the 1930s. And this is some decade. In 10 years, she published 17 novels plus short story collections like 13 Problems, 2 Mary Westmacott novels, several plays, etc. Amongst those 17 novels are iconic works like Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile, and Then There Were None. 3 iconic novels, of all time, not just in mystery. And we also have the introduction of Miss Marple and the 13 Problems and Murder at the Vicarage, the Sitterford Mystery, Pearl at End House, Lord Edgware Dies, 3-Act Tragedy, ABC Murders, Cards on the Table, Appointment with Death, and Hercule Poirot's Christmas. All truly fantastic works. And she does have some duds here, more so than in the 1940s, with the likes of Why Didn't They Ask Evans, Dumb Witness, Death in the Clouds, Murder and Easy, which are all not up to her usual quality, especially in 1930 standards. I wouldn't say they're awful, but they have issues. Most of her 30 novels do not have issues, or major issues at least. The 1930s is when Christie really came into her own and breaks the formula for mystery novels and becomes the queen of crime, the new face of mystery. Before Christie, mystery novels were about a hero who had no interest or life outside of solving the mystery, who would solve the murder. The murder represented a disruption of the status quo. The tranquil society was disrupted, and it was up to the noble hero to repair that disruption by solving the murder and removing the disruptor from society, so everyone else can live their merry lives. Every character was merely a representation of a position in society, and no character besides the murderer ever disrupts it in any way, including, not moving between social classes. Christie changed all of that in the 1930s. She gave her characters nuances, even her heroes. Her books were much more than re-establishing the status quo. She included observations of the time and place she lived in. She delivered commentary on social issues. She played with people's assumptions. She didn't always end her book with justice being served. Her murderers weren't always evil people. It is in this decade where she twists the mystery genre into what it is today. We're out of the Conan Doyle era of these formulaic mysteries that, while not predictable, we always knew how they would end in general terms. You don't know that from Christie. Her works from the 1930s are the works that influenced generations of mystery writers, and still do today. With the exception of Roger Ackroyd, I don't think any of her books from the 1920s are really that influential. And of course, we have the excellent short story collections, the aforementioned 13 Problems, but we also have The Mysterious Mr. Quinn, Parker Pyne Investigates, Murder in the Mews. Those collections are all from the 1930s. The play Black Coffee is from the 1930s. This is truly a magnificent body of work from one author in one decade, and it deserves the top spot at number 1. And that is it for this video. Let me know what your favorite decade of Christie is in the comments, and I'm always open to video suggestions. My biggest fear is that I will run out of ideas, and while I have plenty in mind for now, please keep the suggestions coming. Next week, I have my first review video for a Miss Marple novel, and we are headed to the Caribbean in a Caribbean mystery. This summer, all the review videos I will put out will be travel themed, except for one, which is decidedly set in the summer. It's very summer themed, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.